Hello and welcome to the UFOs of Brazil. Almost exactly a month ago, I made a video about Brazil where I told you the tale of the Varginha encounter. In that story, it included many topics that we all love, including a new alien species, government cover-ups, and UFO sightings. Well, at the time, I assumed I was fairly done with the area, at least for a while. Not saying that there wasn't still a lot to talk about, but I do tend to spread my topics out a bit. However, I was looking into fantastic UFO encounter stories, and once again, I was drawn into the multitude of reports coming from Brazil. So here we are with today's video, talking about a few of those sightings and encounters from that beautiful country. I hope you all kept a hold of your passports, since this is going to be well worth our return visit. UFO sightings in this location are not really a new thing, and in fact it is actually considered quite a hot spot for such activity. Since early 1947, up until recently, as in this year, there have been many sightings of UFOs, including extraterrestrial entities, all over the country. As such, I wanted to talk about a handful of them, and I think you will be as fascinated as I was. Our first story should have been saved for a video about military UFO encounters, but I had to include it here. The military base, known as Fortaleza de Itaipu, or Itaipu Fort, is located in Praia Granja, in the state of São Paulo. On November 4th, 1957, two guards were on patrol when they encountered something that would change their lives. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, they saw what they described as an orange dish-shaped craft that produced its own light flying towards the base, coming from the Atlantic Ocean. They stated that the object kept low altitude, and that it was moving with an incredible amount of speed, as if it was traveling for the purpose of meeting the base. The disc came to an immediate stop and began to hover over the base. As the two men watched in terror, they suddenly became overcome with the feeling that they were being burned. They described the feeling as if they had suddenly caught fire. Both men began to scream in agony, and this woke up the rest of the base, and their fellow soldiers rushed out to see what was wrong. At the sight of the increased number of soldiers, the craft took off just as fast as it had arrived. However, in doing so, it caused all the power in the base to fail, including the emergency systems. The two men were sent to a local hospital and were treated for first and second degree burns that afflicted 10% of their body. Not long after this event, military investigators from the Brazilian Army, the Brazilian Air Force, and even the United States Air Force were sent to the fort to examine the witnesses and attempt to determine what had occurred that night. They could not come up with an earthly explanation, but were obviously apprehensive to admit it was an alien craft. Yet, United States Air Force officer Donald Kehoe did state that it was possible that it could have been extraterrestrial, and that it showed up due to our recent endeavors into reaching outer space. Due to this, he mentioned that the craft could have used a heat ray on the men to send a message that they were more powerful and capable of utilizing advanced technology that we had yet to even discover. More in-depth reports were put together and sent to the United States Brazilian Embassy in 2008. Being it was so long after the event, I can only assume that the investigations turned up evidence that is still within the realm of the unknown. While this video is only focused on Brazil, I did find reports that on that very same night in Oro Grande, New Mexico, an egg-shaped craft was seen, and it disabled quite a few cars' electrical systems. While that could be a coincidence, it is also worth stating that an eyewitness actually sustained severe sunburns when the craft passed over, and this sighting was at night. There also was a report from Madison, Ohio, 6 days after the previous two events, where a witness saw an acorn-shaped craft flying overhead, and not long afterward, she started to notice a strange rash all over her body, and her vision began to fail. After being checked out at the local hospital, they likened her symptoms to that of radiation poisoning. I mentioned these last two due to them being eerily similar to the one in Brazil, and may lend more credence to a possible attack occurring during that same time in multiple locations around the world. The second story in our video was said to have happened a month before the prior story. I know, I should really keep these chronological. This event occurred near Francisco de Sel, which is located in the state of Minas Gerais on October 16th in 1957. A 23-year-old farmer by the name of Antonio Vilas Boas was plowing his fields on that night, since he frequently did this to avoid the heat of the day. While doing so, he suddenly noticed a red object approaching his location, and he described it as looking like a star. As the object grew nearer, it took on an egg shape with a red light in the front, and it started to hover over his field. The craft then started to land on 3 skinny legs, and this was the exact moment that Antonio decided it was time to leave the area. Traveling on his tractor, he only managed to make it a short distance before the electrical system failed inexplicably, and he decided to escape the scene on foot. This too proved fruitless, since within a matter of moments he claimed a 5-foot-tall being wearing gray clothing and a helmet grabbed a hold of him. 3 more beings showed up and helped the first one drag Antonio into their ship. He did note that these beings had very small blue eyes and seemed to communicate with a series of strange yelps. The aliens took him to a room in the ship where all of his clothes were removed, and they applied a strange gel all over his body for unknown reasons. After this, he was directed to another room, which was marked with strange red symbols, and once inside, he stated that they took multiple samples of his blood by cutting his chin. Finally, he was moved once again to yet another room, where he claimed to have sat alone for over half an hour. While he waited, he heard the sound of gas escaping from vents in the walls, and the smell of it caused him to become nauseated. Suddenly, a door opened up, and a female version of the same beings that originally took him stepped into the room. He described her as being around 5 feet tall, having long white hair, a small pointed chin, and her eyes were very large, blue in color, and cat-like. This visitor was completely nude, and Antonio couldn't fight the strong feeling of being attracted to her. It didn't take long before the reason behind this visit was apparent, since her goal was to mate with him. The two had sex, and afterwards he stated she stood up, rubbed her belly, and pointed upwards before leaving the room. Antonio said that he assumed she was telling him that she was going to raise their baby in space. The original aliens showed up and gave him his clothes back and started to escort him off the ship. Before he left, he tried to take a small device that reminded him of a clock as proof of his encounter, but he said his host found out he took it and removed it from him. Once back in his field, he returned home only to find that 4 hours had passed while he was gone. Not long after this encounter, Antonio started to begin suffering from bouts of nausea, small lesions appearing on his body, an intense feeling of weakness, and he noticed that he now bruised very easily. These symptoms happened for quite a few months, and he even went to a doctor to be checked out. The results from the hospital came back with the cause of his ailments resulting from radiation poisoning. With this, he would also lose his appetite and stated his eyes burned almost constantly. Investigations were done with this story, and quite a few theorized that it was a hoax due to a similar story being printed in a magazine called O Cruzeiro on November of that same year. While this is possible, his encounter was said to take place a month before that article was written, although there is no mention as to when he first told anybody about his story, so he might not have talked about it until after November. Later in life, Antonio became a lawyer and had a wife and 4 children. Even as such, he always stuck to his story, and sadly died on January 17, 1991, at the rather young age of 57. Many claim that due to him being a lawyer, and still keeping his story straight, that lends credence to it being real, mainly due to the professional nature of his chosen career. Although, I can see it both ways, and it really is a catch-22 with only 2 options. Either he stuck to his story and risked being seen as a crazy lawyer by some walks of life, or he admitted it was a hoax and was viewed as a liar. Neither option is really that great. Although this very incident is very similar to one that happened in Mata Sul in the same state of São Paulo. On July 28, 1978, a security guard named Antonio Carlos Ferreira claimed to have been knocked out and taken aboard a similar looking spacecraft as Mr. Boas had described by a similar looking 5-foot tall alien. The only difference was that these beings were described as having pointy ears, and many of them had various styles and colors of hair on their heads. While on board, he also was approached by an alien female, and he was forced to mate with her. His story didn't end there, since he also claimed to have been visited by the same species of aliens at least 16 times between 1978 and 1982. In one of those visits, he stated that he was introduced to a young alien, which he was led to believe was his own child from his first encounter. Again, we can't say for sure if the story is true or not. At worst, he could have taken a lot of the details from Mr. Boas' story. However, there are a few similar stories of alien abductions where people claim they are visited multiple times and produce a child with one of the aliens. So, who knows? Our final story is probably one of the most famous events in Brazil. It happened to 3 men on their way home from Rio de Janeiro on September 25th in 1980. At around 10:30 at night, a man named Elias Seixas de Matos was driving his truck along with 2 of his friends on their way home. During their trip, the truck they were in kept having unexplained electrical failures. Rather than devices and lights turning off, they kept turning on. This went on for a while, and it finally culminated when all 3 men became overcome with a sudden onset of exhaustion. While continuing to drive, Elias stated he felt a cold liquid-like feeling rushing down his neck, which was followed by a voice in his head telling him to stop the truck in a particular location. He followed those orders, and once the vehicle was stopped, all 3 men saw a strange blue light wash over the front of the truck. It was then stated that they saw a strange illuminated craft sitting on the road about a mile away from them. Elias exited the vehicle and tried to get an image of what had caused the light. Things in this story get a little confusing from here, but I'll try to make sense of it at the end. It was claimed that while trying to capture a picture of the unknown object, the other 2 men ran away in terror. The story then states that Elias again started feeling drowsy and asked one of his friends to drive their truck the rest of the way home. Again, I must mention, I will touch on this at the end, since in one moment his friends are running away, and then the next they are all back in the truck. Once arriving at their destination, they all realized that a trip that should have taken 20 minutes took them quite a few hours. Unable to shake the feeling that he was missing something that happened that night, he later would undergo hypnosis to uncover the truth. While in this state, he recalled being transported into a fiery red cigar-shaped craft. Elias was then transferred to an egg-shaped room with a table in the center, and there were all types of odd mechanical devices on shelves in the room. A 7-foot-tall alien wearing tight-fitting yellow coveralls approached him. He described the being as having large, slanted, lilac-colored eyes. It had a long nose, a broad mouth without lips, and it had very long limbs. Elias stated that the being seemed to have some type of force field around him, which kept Elias from coming in contact with the being. While in the room, he was subjected to all types of tests, including blood and other bodily fluid samples being taken. At one point, he noted 2 other beings in the room, which he stated one was black while the other was white, but they appeared to look identical to each other. In an odd detail, he mentioned that those 2 wore gray clothing, which is similar to the previous story that Mr. Boas had mentioned. While on board the craft, he said his alien hosts told him that their home was located in Ursa Minor, and that they even had a base on Mars. That is where the story ends. Obviously, with stories like these, I can't add too much perspective, since, while they seem a little out there, I can't say that they didn't happen. I do want to mention the friends running away and then suddenly being back in the vehicle. Outside of it possibly being a huge indicator that the story is false, I can play devil's advocate and offer an alien explanation. Maybe the men did run away, but were abducted by the same aliens and then were returned to the truck after they were done. There are a few variables in the story that make it unclear if the abduction was said to happen before Elias returned to the truck or after. So who really knows? In ending this video, I did want to mention that there are a lot more stories like this in Brazil, and I do urge you to look into them yourself. You certainly won't be disappointed. Also, while I do question a few of these stories, I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression. Out of all the topics that I make videos about, aliens and UFOs are two subjects that I do firmly believe exist. This also goes into my mentality in these type of topics, that just because I question the authenticity, I am in no way putting any of these people down or making a joke of their reports. As you all well know, I never do that. My channel is a welcoming place, and I firmly believe in innocent until proven guilty, for the lack of a better phrase. If you haven't yet done so, do please consider subscribing to my channel for more content like this, and also I'd greatly appreciate it if you could share my videos with someone you know who may be interested in this type of genre. With that, be safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Later!